It's time for questions and reflections. And coffee. It's definitely time for coffee. Coffee and philosophy. This rhyme for a reason. First up on the menu is Descartes. In what way was Descartes similar to Socrates? So at the top of page 234, Alberto starts us off with Descartes decided to travel around Europe the way Socrates spent his life talking to people in Athens. He relates that from then on he meant to confine himself to seeking the wisdom that was to be found either within himself or in the great book of the world. What makes this actually similar to Socrates isn't immediately apparent. Gaarder is not saying, or Alberto here is not saying outright what that distinction is between, remember, Socrates versus the sophists. So while you may be recalling that Socrates said that I essentially know nothing, he was also contrasting himself from the sophists by saying there is something absolute in the world. The sophists who are in the meantime saying everything's relative and dependent on the human scale, and we can't really know things. Not all of them, but some of them, right? Most of them. Socrates was being contrasted to that. Here too, Descartes is being contrasted in a similar way. He's saying, I want to go back to the first principles. I want to look at the world, and I want to understand what the absolutes are, the clear and distinct ideas are of the world to get this right. And then we go to the next page, 235, and towards the top of that one too. Sophie says he must have been ahead of his time, and Alberto says, but the question belonged to the age. When it came to acquiring certain knowledge, many of his contemporaries voiced a total philosophic skepticism. Remember in the in-depth section too, we were talking about the difference between skepticism via the status quo and then Cartesian skepticism. They thought that man should accept that he knew nothing, but Descartes would not. Had he done so, he would not have been a real philosopher. We can again draw a parallel with Socrates, who did not accept the skepticism of the sophists. But there's one more place where this is referenced. On page 239, right down at the bottom, it says, again, Alberto is talking, it is a decidedly rationalistic way of thinking. Descartes believed, like Socrates and Plato, that there is a connection between reason and being. Multiple parallels being drawn between Descartes and Socrates. One of those is the absolutism. That is, there is a sense of something. It's not all about ignorance and what we don't know, but that it is possible to know something of a sort. And for Descartes, it's this way of clear and distinct ideas, and for Socrates / Plato, it's reason. Remember way back I said Plato is among the first of the real true rationalists. We didn't quite know what that meant back then, but now that you've seen the in-depth look video in this module, you hopefully have a better sense of what we meant by that. And then this sort of second bit where he went even farther with the sort of skepticism. You could say that what Socrates essentially did is he said even the sophists who claim that you can't, that all things are relative and so on and so forth, still claim knowledge, some form of knowledge based on this philosophy. And Socrates was saying knowledge is a dubious thing, and what is knowable certainly has very little to nothing to do with your relativism. The next question states, what was Descartes' critical insight, which he expressed as cogito ergo sum? We again went to lengths to talk about that in the in-depth video, but let's directly reference Gaarder here. He says on page 238, midway down, Descartes ends up doubting absolutely everything. Many philosophers before him had reached the end of the road at that very point. But Descartes tried to work forward from this 0 point. He doubted everything, and that was the only thing he was certain of. But now something struck him. One thing had to be true, and that was that he doubted. When he doubted, he had to be thinking, and because he was thinking, it had to be certain that he was a thinking being. Or as he expressed it himself, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. This phrase, by the way, is a great one to drop on people at cocktail parties. Cogito ergo sum, I think therefore, yeah, it's a good one. So the critical insight here is that by way of his Cartesian form of skepticism, he gets rid of all things capable of being doubted, and at the bottom it turns out it's not absolutely everything. The one thing that cannot be doubted is thinking itself, the thing that is doubting. And so he builds back up from that. That's his critical insight, is that we can find a place of absolute clarity and distinction or certainty, and from there build back up the world as we know it. The next question, how is Descartes' concept of the body as mechanical or automaton, and the mind the only part of us that is free, related to how we view the human brain today? We'll get to the second part of that question in a second. This is a bit of a doozy. I'm asking for a little bit more than Gaarder has actually offered here, but I think you can manage this. So let's first get a direct reference. Page 241, this is 2/3 down. According to Descartes, the human body is a perfect machine, but man also has a mind which can operate quite independently of the body. The bodily processes do not have the same freedom. They obey their own laws. Mind-body distinction again. But what we think with our reason does not happen in the body, it happens in the mind, which is completely independent of extended reality. And then skip over to 242. Thus, humans have the capacity to rise above bodily needs and behave rationally. In this sense, the mind is superior to the body. Our legs can age and become weak. The back can become bowed or bowed perhaps, and our teeth can fall out. But 2 and 2 will go on being 4 as long as there is reason left in us. Reason doesn't become bowed and weak. It is the body that ages. And for Descartes, the mind is essentially thought. And remember, that's an important distinction to make, because one argument that people are liable to make is, well, what about feelings and sensations? And that's what's going on here. You have thought, and then you have feelings, which seem to sometimes inform thought or curb thought, bend it in some particular direction. And those feelings are related directly or indirectly to the sensations of what's going on in the world. And here we are going back to experience or the extension or the body in order to get to the mind. And he's saying, no, thought in essence has nothing to do with your feelings. And then we need to jump down again a little bit. About 3/4 of the way down that same page, 242, Descartes made a point of the fact that ingenious inventions of that kind were actually assembled very simply from a relatively small number of parts, compared with the vast number of bones, muscles, nerves, veins, and arteries that the human and the animal body consists of. Why should God not be able to make an animal or a human body based on mechanical laws? Nowadays, there is a lot of talk about artificial intelligence, says Sophie. Yes, that is the automaton of our time. Now, we haven't really touched on before how regularly Gaarder touches on computers and artificial intelligence specifically. There's a reason for that, but again, we're putting off this second part of the question for a little bit longer. Let's first address this thing about the brain. How do we often talk about the brain? Do we mean the same thing by brain and mind? I think most people would probably say that the brain is the organ, it's the material thing, and if there's a mind to speak of, the mind is either you'll have an epiphenomenal account of this that says that mind is something that isn't brain but isn't in the brain, it's something else. Or some people would say mind is literally in the brain, it emerges from all the neural structures perhaps of brain. There are lots of different explanations here. But I think most people would nonetheless say that if mind exists, it is not the same thing as brain. It would not be material. That brain would be the material aspect, if we were to use Spinoza's language, and that the mind would be the immaterial aspect. Now, you may have come up with a different answer for this. Maybe you see the brain and mind as being different things, or maybe you see them in sort of a Hobbesian materialist way as being really just talking about the same basic thing. But regardless of that, let's take a look at the second part of the question. What is the significance of Sophie and Alberto's experience with his computer in this context of the automaton? So the very beginning of the book starts out with Sophie. We just bypassed it because there was nothing to make sense of at the time except the fact that Sophie is obviously a very curious individual. Fast forward again, bring this back to the Descartes chapter. And we can see that on page 245, they get introduced to Layla, a data program. After Sophie has had some interactions with Layla, Alberto and tries to force the computer program to produce, or at least call up, or find, at the very least, find Hilda's father. Alberto says to Sophie, she's right, meaning Layla's right, the data program's right. This is not a crystal ball, Layla is only a data program. Shut up, wrote Sophie. As you wish, Sophie. Our acquaintance lasted only 13 minutes and 52 seconds. I shall remember everything we have said. I shall now end the program. The letter C:, once again, showed up on the screen. Now we can sit down again, said Alberto. But Sophie had already pressed some other keys. Nag, she wrote. Immediately, the following message appeared on the screen. Here I am. Now it was Alberto who jumped. Who are you? Wrote Sophie. Major Albert Nag at your service. I came straight from Lebanon. What is your command? This beats everything, breathed Alberto. The rat has sneaked onto the hard disk. Now, obviously, there's this great moment where we now finally can put a name to Hilda's father, and we know it's not Alberto Knox. If this is Albert Nag communicating on the other end, Alberto Knox is right there in the room. They do not appear to be the same person. We also got his name, and as Alberto notices, it's very similar to his name, but they're not the same person, so that puts that to rest a little bit. But it would be really easy to overlook, again, part of the broader theme going on here about the computer. The computer program was mechanically, if you will, although it's more like digitally in the case of computers, nonetheless, the automaton of our time, it was programmed to do a certain thing, and it did it. But then as soon as Sophie pushed it to go another step beyond what it was programmed to do, then something almost magical seeming happened. What does this say about the brain and mind? Joanna felt sure that the brain is, in her argument at the very beginning of the book, the brain is equivalent to the hardware of a human being. Does that mean maybe the software has yet to be defined? Maybe this is what Sophie's getting at in thinking that there's got to be more than that to a person, to be a human being with a brain, is to have both hardware and software. What is the software? Is the software mind? Can the mind or software of said computer do these unexpected things, result in these phenomena that we did not program it to do? Again, you can go down this path of maybe it's an emergent phenomenon because of all the hardware, bugs and stuff come up in software, or new elaborations of things we couldn't have predicted or calculated come up. Back in the day when computers were really becoming more prominent in the workings of mathematics, an incredible man named Mandelbrot conceptualized the fractal. The fractal, not in the colloquial sense that some people use it, but a true fractal, one that is what happens when you start to see I won't say self-similar per se, but a pattern emerge where larger pictures do have a certain similarity to smaller microscopic versions of the same picture. And so you look at the Mandelbrot set and you zoom in on any one aspect on that diagram, utilizing a version of the Cartesian coordinate system, by the way, just to tie it back to Descartes. And you'll notice patterns emerging. You'll even find replications of the entirety of the Mandelbrot set inside there. Now, there's no way these could have been predicted, but in a way, they're also results of a computer program being told what to do. So perhaps really there is something of a compatibility there between this sort of deterministic view of the brain, a mechanistic, mechanical version of brain as an automaton, but at the same time a mind that seems capable of emerging from that and producing results we wouldn't expect otherwise, such as Albert Nag coming out of the woodwork finally when he was not even supposed to be on the hard drive. Let's jump now to Spinoza. What was Spinoza's suggested approach toward the Bible that landed him in trouble with the authority of the church and his community? We want to go to 247, the beginning page for the Spinoza chapter. And jumping down towards the bottom, it says, he, Spinoza, was the first to apply what we call a historical-critical interpretation of the Bible. He denied that the Bible was inspired by God down to the last letter. When we read the Bible, he said we must continually bear in mind the period in which it was written in. The period it was written in. A critical reading, such as the one he proposed, revealed a number of inconsistencies in the text. And, of course, it goes further on page 248. They tried to disinherit him on the grounds of his heresy. Paradoxically enough, few have spoken out more powerfully in the cause of free speech and religious tolerance than Spinoza. So he was emphasizing how important history played a role in the writing and even design of the Bible as we've inherited it, and that we have to take that into account to allow for more freedom and possibly even getting to higher levels of understanding, possibly even higher levels of development of that religion and its texts. Next up, despite their similarities, what was distinctly different between Spinoza and Descartes regarding their ontologies for substances, specifically the overall number of them? Hopefully, if not directly from the book, by the end of the in-depth lecture, you had it hammered into your heads that there is the dualism of the dualism of Descartes and the monism of Spinoza. Dualism, of course, correlating with the number 2, the two-ness in substance, and the oneness in substance that is monism. But we want a little bit more than that. We want clear and distinct, not just ideas, but references here. Take a look at page 250, midway down. The word substance can be interpreted as that which something consists of, or that which something basically is or can be reduced to. Descartes operated then with 2 of these substances. Everything was either thought or extension. However, Spinoza rejected this split. He believed that there was only one substance. Everything that exists can be reduced to one single reality, which he simply called substance. At times he called it God or nature. Thus Spinoza does not have the dualistic view of reality that Descartes had. We say he is a monist. That is, he reduces nature and the condition of all things to one single substance. Okay, hopefully that's enough for you there. Let's take a look at the last set of questions regarding the chapter on Locke. What was Locke's reasoning for arguing for empiricism, or basing epistemological concerns on the senses and experience, which is just the definition of empiricism, over the rationalism espoused by those like Descartes? Again, we touched on this in depth, but let's go on in and take a look. Page 262 in the Locke chapter, we get an empiricist will derive all knowledge of the world from what the senses tell us. The classic formulation of an empirical approach came from Aristotle. Yay, Aristotle. He said, there is nothing in the mind except what was first in the senses. This view implied a pointed criticism of Plato, the rationalist, remember, who had held that man brought with him a set of innate ideas from the world of ideas. Locke repeats Aristotle's words, and when Locke uses them, they are aimed at Descartes. We have no innate ideas or conceptions about the world we are brought into before we have seen it. If we do have a conception or an idea that cannot be related to experienced facts, then it will be a false conception. When we, for instance, use words like God, eternity, or substance, reason is being misused because nobody has experienced them, God, eternity, or what philosophers have called substance. This makes substance sound like an extremely rationalist idea, and perhaps in the end it is. That said, perhaps we can argue, of course, that the sciences are primarily an empiricist endeavor, which is why we have to be very careful about the way that we try and talk about the relationship between the sciences and philosophy, as one being of questions that can be answered by science as an empiricist endeavor, and questions that can't be answered by science that then get just kind of pushed and shoved over to the realms of philosophy, where there's no empiricist pursuit there. It's more complicated than that. There's also an empiricist and a rationalist branch of philosophy, and we can argue that there's even some subtle nuances between those as well. So those kind of very broad sweeping stereotypes of the relations between those two disciplines is quite off the mark most of the time. How would you describe Locke's concept of tabula rasa, or blank slate? I'll again provide the reference from Gaarder, but then try, of course, as always, to use your own words. So that's just on the next page over on 263. Locke's claim is that all our thoughts and ideas issue from that which we have taken in through the senses. Before we perceive anything, the mind is a tabula rasa, or an empty slate. I've called it the blank slate as well. Before we sense anything, then, the mind is as bare and empty as a blackboard before the teacher arrives in the classroom. Locke also compared the mind to an unfurnished room, but then we begin to sense things. We see the world around us, we smell, taste, feel, and hear. In this way, what Locke called simple ideas of sense arise. Of course, he doesn't stop there, Locke that is, doesn't stop there with the tabula rasa, but says how we build all of our much more complex and reason-based ideas as well. But nonetheless, this is the foundation for his philosophy. There's, in a sense, nothing there. Then we start sensing and inputting through the senses all the material or content, let's say, for ideas to form. And from those simple ideas, more complex ideas form. I see the horn of a rhino, and I see an abnormally large horse, and maybe I put those two things together, and I've got now a horse with a giant horn on its head, a unicorn. That's a complex idea, you could say, of two simpler ideas, and those in turn were built perhaps on simpler ideas as well, but they first derived from the senses. And finally, last question, what is an example of a primary quality and a secondary quality of, say, an apple or a soccer ball, according to Locke? So let's again take a moment to find the reference so that we are clear on what Gaarder means by that. I think you're already clear on what I mean by it from the in-depth lecture. At the bottom of 264, he says, by primary qualities, he, Locke, meant extension, weight, motion, and number, and so on. When it is a question of qualities such as these, we can be certain that the senses reproduce them objectively, but we also sense other qualities in things. We say that something is sweet or sour, green or red, hot or cold. Locke calls these secondary qualities. Sensations like these, color, smell, taste, sound, do not reproduce the real qualities that are inherent in the things themselves. They reproduce only the effect of the outer reality on our senses. And again, that things in themselves bit is going to come back again with Kant. Bookmark it. Everyone can agree on the primary qualities like size and weight because they lie within the objects themselves, but the secondary qualities like color and taste can vary from person to person and from animal to animal, depending on the nature of the individual's sensations. By the way, I have to just point out the fact that even Alberto here, and therefore in some way Gaarder, is only pointing out this matter as it pertains to humans and other animals. So apparently this is a knowledge-making device that can only be approached by way of sentience, by things that can sense. So it makes you wonder, does that rule out the possibility that minerals or droplets of lava or the foam that seems to encrust a newly formed nebula in deep space, that these things can't have some form of perception or experience? And this is one of those questions that I think that we tend to not entertain much due to the limitations we impose of empiricism and therefore science on our minds about how to talk about these things. But maybe consider entertaining them for a time. Let's get back to the question. the primary quality and secondary quality of an apple, or at least one of each. Well, the apple, as you can probably guess, has a certain weight, and it'll probably have a certain shape. It's definitely not square. It's roundish, we'd say. I don't know of any square apples, although there is such a thing as a square watermelon that they make in Japan, which are pretty fun. Go look up square watermelon if you've never seen it. It's not technically a square, it's technically a cube, for the record. But even that has rounded edges. There's no way you could have a perfect cube formed from a fruit. So even there, even if you have fairly flat sides, you're still going to have these rounded edges. Other primary qualities of the apple would include, if I were to throw it from here across the room, I could actually measure the trajectory in some form of parabola, and we could make calculations from there and come to the same conclusions about that motion. These are at least the ways of talking about the apple in terms of primary qualities a la Locke. Secondary qualities are, of course, the redness of the apple. Actually, I have a fake apple here. I probably should have started with it in my hand. So, wish I could eat it. But the redness, or in this case, kind of yellowish tinge of the apple, and somebody might look at that, and you might even through the camera right now look at that and say, I don't think that's red at all. That looks like a whitish, an off-white, characterized with some dark brown patches. And that's fair. I mean, maybe you have a better sense of it. The light's reflecting off of it into the camera lens more easily than reflecting off of it into my eyes at this moment. So maybe you have a more accurate picture of it. But what do we mean by that? Probably nothing, says Locke. It means there's no correct picture in terms of secondary qualities to go off of here. Another thing would be its smell. Well, it's plastic, so that's what it smells like. But if it were an apple, I would expect it to smell fairly sweet and taste fairly sweet if I tasted it, and so forth. Soccer ball, I will leave to you to try to describe. I think you can do as well a job as anyone with that example as well. We are done answering these questions, but I want to take a quick moment to point out some sort of Easter eggs that I just can't help but want to point out for the sake of you trying to solve this mystery. I just want to point in a general direction as to what is really important in figuring out the mystery that is going on here in Sophie's world. One thing is on 246 again, if we go back a little bit, when the computer program, did you take a look at those dates really carefully? This is when Alberto Knox pulls up the directory on the computer to find the files and erase any memory on the computer of Nag's presence. And one of those dates is 6/15, the other is 6/23, and that is June 15th and June 23rd. You can ignore the year. But think through, what day is it right now in Sophie's world? And what day will it soon be? What relevance do these dates have to the story? Take a look at that. There's another quick reference that has to do actually more directly with philosophy and the parallels between the philosophy we're talking about and Hilda's father, who we now know to be Albert Nag. And again, we're having to call back up that parallel, the theme we established several lectures back now, that Hilbert's father is being represented as some sort of a god, or at least when we're talking about God in philosophy in the book, we're at once also maybe hinting at aspects of Hilda's father in Sophie's world. So, looking on 252, which pertains to something we were already talking about earlier, but I'll read out loud. So it follows that all thoughts that we think are also God's or nature's thoughts. For everything is one. There is only one God, one nature, or one substance. But listen, when I think something, I'm the one who's doing the thinking. When I move, I'm doing the moving. Why do you have to mix God into it, says Sophie. I like your involvement, but who are you? You are Sophie Amundsen. You are also the expression of something infinitely bigger. You can, if you wish, say that you are thinking or that you are moving, but could you not also say that it is nature that is thinking your thoughts, or that it is nature, remember Spinoza equates nature with God, that it is nature that is thinking your thoughts, or that it is nature that is moving through you? It's really just a question of which lenses you choose to look through. Are you saying I cannot decide for myself? Yes and no. You may have the right to move your thumb any way you choose, but your thumb can only move according to its nature. It cannot jump off your hand and dance about the room. In the same way you also have your place in the structure of existence, you also have your place... Oops. In the same way you also have your place in the structure of existence, my dear, you are Sophie, but you are also a finger of God's body. So God decides everything I do. Or nature, or the laws of nature. Spinoza believed that God, or the laws of nature, is the inner cause of everything that happens. He is not an outer cause, since God speaks through the laws of nature and only through them. I'm not sure I can see the difference. God is not a puppeteer who pulls all the strings, controlling everything that happens. A real puppet master controls the puppets from outside and is therefore the outer cause of the puppet's movements. But that is not the way God controls the world. God controls the world through natural laws. So God or nature is the inner cause. Underline that. Inner cause of everything that happens. This means that everything in the material world happens through necessity. All right, if that isn't enough of a flag for you, I don't know what is. Next week, we will, of course, be talking about the empiricists, and we will finally have unveiled the true cause and nature of this mystery, at least in part, what's going on behind the scenes with Berkeley. I can't wait to talk about it with you then.